everybody. Welcome to another episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish. I'm your host, Grant Pemberton. And on this episode, when you're hearing it right now, we're going to have a very topical episode, maybe even a spooky episode. No, we're not. You guys have been asking, and we've been getting a tremendous amount of mail and questions about Halloween. And so on this episode, I'm grilling Ken. What's the deal with Halloween? Can you have a happy Halloween? Does it have to be a scary Halloween? Ken, here we are again. Bible answer man. Everybody wants to know what your thoughts are. I know that's not your favorite position to be. I know you'd rather talk about biblical truths and the New Reformation and all of that sort of stuff, but nonetheless, welcome to the seat that you're in. People want to know. They want to know your opinion, and frankly, I do too. So I'm not 100. I know we just talked very briefly about this, but I still don't know your opinion. So Halloween, why don't you just roll with it? How do we start?
Well, let's start with the name. How about that? That's a pretty good place to start. So many people are simply unaware because we don't even talk about this stuff anymore. But Halloween is actually the contraction of two words. The first word is hallow, H-A-L-L-O, not hollow. That would be H-O-L-L-O-W, but hallow, H-A-L-L-O-W. And then the second word is actually even, E-V-E-N. I know it's not the way we say it or spell it, but I'm just giving everyone the etymology here.
Halloween. So that kind of sounds like it. Halloween.
Well, it is actually. And, the word comes from Middle English. And so even is an old-fashioned word for evening. In fact, sometimes, particularly in poetry, you'll still find the word eventide, which means at evening or dusk or sundown, something like that. That's what eventide is. And so when we say hallow even, we're dropping off the tide part of eventide, and we're saying it's hallow evening. So query, what is hallow? Well, the only place anybody uses the word hallow anymore besides the word Halloween is if they're praying the Lord's Prayer, because in English usage, commonly we say, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed," or may it be hallowed. That's again, it's an older way of saying it, Victorian English. It's not quite Middle English, but it comes out of Middle English. Hallowed be thy name. So when we talk about Halloween, we are talking about the hallowing or making holy, or another way of saying it is the consecration of a particular evening. That's what Halloween literally means, to consecrate or make holy a specific evening. And of course, this leads to the question, which evening? And the evening in question is October the 31st. Well, someone might say, well, okay, so what's the deal with October the 31st? This actually has nothing to do with October the 31st. It has everything to do with November the 1st, which traditionally in the church calendar, which governed most of timekeeping in the Western world from, effectively from the fall of Rome. So you can pick either the year 410 AD or the year 476 AD. There are differences of opinion of when did Rome fall. Some historians even want to argue, did Rome ever really fall? But it at least opened its gates to foreign armies and was no longer kind of the biggest power in the world, particularly in the Western Empire. So we're talking somewhere in the 5th century, either early 5th century or maybe mid to late 5th century AD. And after that time, the calendar really became adjusted because the church was the dominant power in the fading years of Rome. And there's a whole story behind that. With anything, the question is how much to include, how much to exclude, lest it get too long-winded. but we'll just say the church was the dominant power. And so, out of that, almost inevitably, timekeeping came according to the ecclesiastical calendar. And All Saints' Day, which is November 1, was historically the holiest day of the Christian year. It was more holy than Easter. And the reason that it was the holiest day is All Saints' Day was the day in which the church traditionally honored all of the saints that didn't maybe even have their own feast day. There's a feast day of Saint Joseph. It's on March the 19th. There's a feast day for Saint Mary. There's a feast day for some of the major saints. And generally they either commemorate the birth of that saint or sometimes their martyrdom. For example, Saint Valentine's Day commemorates the martyrdom of Saint Valentinus. And I don't remember now the year. In my mind, it's in the mid 250s, but I can't remember the exact year. Google could answer that for us in a moment. But anyway, St. Valentine's Day commemorates the martyrdom of St. Valentine, who was a bishop. So it's usually their birthday or their martyrdom day, their death day. But there were all these people that were holy people. They had lived their lives according to the dictates of Christ. They had lived exemplary lives. They were nominated and named in the Catholic tradition, which at that time was pretty much the only game in town. They were named as saints within the church, which means they not only led extraordinary lives exhibiting the fruit of the Spirit and the character of Christ, patience and self-control and kindness and so forth. They were not only known for their many good deeds. According to Catholic doctrine, they also have to have had certified miracles associated with them. And so the Catholic Church has always been very careful to, I would just say, investigate claims of miracles and to exclude anything that could be excluded, but anything that survived scrutiny. And again, don't think for a minute that this is just a fast and loose roulette game. It's not. Anything that survives scrutiny, they would say, all right, well, now this person is a candidate for beatification and ultimately to become a saint. And so when we talk about All Saints' Day, we've got all these, thousands of saints, tens of thousands of saints who didn't have their own day, maybe because they were lesser known. Maybe they come from an obscure part of the empire. There's only so many days in the calendar. And so, after we kind of use up the big ones like Peter and Mary and people like that, where do we go? Well, we have one day where we lump them all together. So All Saints' Day, November 1, has historically been the holiest day in the Christian year. Again, greater than Easter, greater than any of the other major saint days, because all of these saints are celebrated on that day. And so Halloween becomes the evening before All Hallows Day or All Holy Ones Day. It's interesting, this morning I was looking at something in Hebrew. And in fact, now they didn't have this term in biblical Hebrew, but in modern Hebrew, the word for Halloween is the evening before the day of all the holy ones. That is literally what it is in Hebrew. So even the modern Hebrew captures this notion. That's the origin of the word Halloween.
Wow. It's interesting too, as I just think through just even that thought process from a, modern Western evangelical, charismatic, whatever else I am. We have a problem with death. Like we don't view that, I don't think, in a healthy way, and we don't honor people who have gone before us. We have a problem with honor. And just the older I get and the more in ministry that I am, and the more I see ministers and all of that blow up and crash and burn, the more I actually hold a higher place of honor for people that are, doing things well and finishing well. And there's something to be honored in that. And that's cool. I didn't even know that was a part of it. So here's to hoping we can at least reclaim that.
Well, that's actually ultimately where I want to go to in this conversation. I don't want to get ahead of it. But I do think we need to reclaim this idea of All Hallows Day of November 1, and with it the evening before. By the way, why would you celebrate the evening before? Because traditionally in the church, you held vigil on the nights before any major event. What is holding vigil? Well, you pray. You might pray alone. You may pray with others. Sometimes in the Middle Ages, this was known as a watch night service, which the term itself kind of tells you what it means. It means to keep watch through the night. But this is why Halloween became such a big deal, because the Christians would gather, again, sometimes alone, but often in groups, and they would hold vigil ahead of All Saints' Day because this was such an important holiday.
It's interesting.
So when we say Halloween, when we say All Saints' Day, I just want to reinforce something I've already said. This was the common understanding for well over 1,500 years. If Rome fell in the 5th century, so the 400s, Halloween, as I've described it, was intact well into the early 20th century. So the 20th century is the 1900s. So there's 1,500 years of tradition that are flowing through this idea of All Saints' Day. Now, let's be really clear about this. There was no trick-or-treating going on, in the year 910 or in the year 655 or in the year 1342. Nobody was doing trick-or-treating. They were just holding watch night services, and they were thinking about, the coming celebration of the saints. They would have a big communion service, but it was harvest time. And so many times, in addition to commemorating all that the saints had done, there would be prayers offered, prayers of thanksgiving for the abundance of the Lord, for the abundant harvest, the corn crop, the wheat crop, pumpkins, of course, would be part of that. There would be other things that, people were raising. I'm not going to sit here and, impress everybody with my ability to name various agricultural commodities, but really it became a service of thanksgiving unto the Lord for providing the goodness of the earth and rendering provision that would carry them through the winter, and particularly in Northern Europe, because remember, for centuries, Christianity's stronghold, its real like ground zero, was the Northern and Southern European countries. And so, winter could be a long, dark affair. It could be very cold. We didn't have global warming back then. And so, so people were thinking about the fact that God had been good enough to give them what they needed to carry them through the winter. And it could be stored, whether it was in a grain cellar or a root cellar or a silo of some kind. But there was all of that. I really think that there's value in reclaiming these things. When my children were little, of course, like every kid, they saw Halloween coming. They saw their friends talking about what costumes they were going to have, and going trick-or-treating is always popular, because who doesn't want a bunch of sugar when you're a kid? And so, we had a little bit of a tightrope to walk, but very early on, I mean, starting when they were maybe 3 years old, my children got saved young. I personally led both of them to the Lord. My daughter Carissa came along later. I don't mean to exclude her, but actually she got saved in a service I was leading in a town not far from where we currently live. So anyway, I led my kids to the Lord. I myself did it. Let me just suggest to some of our listeners who are either parents, young parents, or maybe who are going to be parents, you should actually begin asking the Lord that you might lead your children to faith, that you might be the one to introduce them to Jesus, pray with them to receive him. And if that seems weird or awkward or difficult or strange to you, let me just suggest to you that for too long, we have remanded over to the church the job of raising our children in the faith. And I don't actually think that's a good idea. I mean, the church should be teaching the faith. If the church doesn't teach the faith, no one's going to teach the faith. But I think we need to have a direct personal responsibility for raising our children according to the dictates and ways of the Lord. And if we will take that seriously and take that on, I believe God will add his blessing to it. We have this famous saying out of the book of Joshua, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And so the intention of God was always that we raise our children according to his ways. So my wife and I were very intentional about this when our children were young, and we taught them about what Halloween was. Now, I've kind of drawn it out and elaborated a bit more than I would do with a 3 or a 4-year-old. But when they were very young, we just said, you know what Halloween is really about is this is a day we commemorate all the good people who lived their lives well and who then went on to be with Jesus. And they got that. They understood what that was. And that was enough for a long time. Later on, we unpacked it more as they got into kind of the late primary grades and moved into middle school. And, they still wanted to go trick-or-treating, even maybe in 9th and 10th grade. I think by 11th grade, the hand had been played. But with this, we didn't need to do any lying. Sometimes people get caught in this lie about the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus. We didn't have to do any of that. We just said, look, this is a Christian holiday. And we told them very clearly that all of this emphasis on ghosts and which, by the way, what is a ghost? It's a spirit. The word Geist in German, which is where we get the word ghost from, is the same word that we use for spirit in German. So, the nature of these ghosts is they are pretty uniformly not necessarily viewed as good spirits. These are negative or bad spirits. The term we tend to use today is demons. So all of this emphasis on ghosts, ghouls, people with axes or knives in their heads, the Walking Dead, a lot of these costumes and, all of that kind of iconography is really what it is the hijacking of our Christian holiday. And it began in the 1930s, and it really kind of reached its ascent in the mid 50s, even in that supposedly holy time before the sexual revolution, during the Korean War, when America was still allegedly Christian. There was already some cultural drift going on. I think both World War I and World War II, along with the Great Depression, were kind of wake-up calls for a lot of people. This was certainly true in Europe. And I think to a lesser extent, but a measurable extent, it was also true of the United States, Canada, et cetera. And so,
just in case you're listening to this and not watching this, many of those words were in bunny ear quotations to basically say, we've always struggled as a people to do the will of the Lord all the way back to Israel. So there wasn't necessarily a golden age here in America. Just for those that are listening on Spotify or Apple or Google Play or not watching us on YouTube. So
yeah. Thanks for clarifying that. I
we're on the Charisma Podcast Network. Welcome you guys as well. So if you're listening to us through that as well. But yeah. Anyway, sorry I interrupted, Ken.
Yeah, no problem at all. No problem at all. So things began to change in the United States in the 1930s, and then this kind of accelerated through the 40s and into the 50s. And as I said, a lot of the I think there was a kind of the beginnings of the great falling away as a result of the carnage of World War I and even the greater carnage of World War II. And then we, enter into the 60s and we get into Vietnam, and, the world starts to really come unraveled, and people are explicitly and openly repudiating ideas that had undergirded our society. But in the earlier 20th century, in the 1930s, I would say America was still at least substantially governed by a Christian ethos or a Christian mindset. The Bible was still largely honored. There are certainly plenty of exceptions we could talk about. One would be the Scopes monkey trial, which occurred in the 1920s, 25. And, around that time, we have people like Gertrude Stein. She's one of the first actually openly lesbian poets. And so, she was living in France and kind of, pursuing what the beginnings of an alternative lifestyle. I mean, certainly there had been gay and lesbian people around for centuries, but Gertrude Stein was kind of the first one to stand up and say, hey, I'm going to be counted as this. And then we've got the Scopes monkey trial. And if you don't know what that's about, it occurred actually in Tennessee, your home state, Grant, where there was a man named John Scopes, and he wanted to teach Charles Darwin in the schools. And he was taken to trial for teaching contrary to the Bible. And none other than William Jennings Bryan, who was the Democratic nominee for president in the year that case went to trial, or excuse me, the year coming up. So he would become the Democratic nominee for president. This shows you the sensibility of America. It's data points like this that show us kind of where the general thinking was. So anyway, we have that going on in the 20s and the 30s. Halloween starts to take on a decidedly less Christian air to it. And it doesn't just go to harvest. It goes to things like, ghosts and goblins and ghouls and all of that sort of thing. And it accelerates through the 40s. Of course, we know the 40s were marked by World War II and the even greater carnage of World War II than of World War I. That was a huge disillusionment to an entire generation. I don't think we really can realize just how big of a disillusionment it was, but it's really out of the 40s that on the Jewish side, people like Franz Rosenzweig emerge writing about the death of God. And ultimately, the Catholic and Protestant churches pick up some of this language, begin to talk about the death of God and, what do we do after God, and things like that. And so now in the 50s, what's happened? Well, we see our first atomic bombings, 2 of them in 1945. And by the 1950s, we have the Korean War and we have the Cold War, where the world stands at the brink of nuclear disaster. And, I saw an article not long ago, and I can't remember the exact number, but between the US and the Soviet Union in the 1950s, with the Cold War, where they weren't actually, shooting nuclear weapons at each other, there were more than 600 nuclear tests conducted, where atomic weapons were detonated in our atmosphere, sometimes above the atmosphere. There was one, they detonated a nuclear weapon in the upper ionosphere, and they dubbed it Operation Starfish. And it actually caused the entire of the night sky to glow. It ionized the upper atmosphere. It took 10 years for that to resolve. This is the world that people were living in. And so really, this is when, technology beyond the Industrial Revolution begins to run away. And I think the popular sentiment, this is my theory, I can't give you a specific scholar that agrees with this, but I believe that it was really in that period that, at least as it pertains to Halloween, people weren't really in the mood to be celebrating Christian saints. They were thinking about, living on the edge of doomsday, of Armageddon. And it's really out of that this focus on death and ghouls and, skeletons and Dracula and all of that starts to make its way into the popular consciousness. And I might just say, at this point, I think it really serves as an object lesson for all of us, that we really need to guard what's been entrusted to us. Paul uses this language when he's writing to Timothy in 2 Timothy. He says, "Oh, Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to you." Well, we have been entrusted with a Christian tradition, with a Christian worldview, with an understanding of who God is and what that means. And so often we actually let the wider society, the effects that are going on, the memes in the media, nowadays social media, we let all of that drive how we think about and frame all of this. I think when we look at that period in the 40s and the 50s, what we're really seeing is the beginnings of the deconstruction of everything that was that. It was known in the Middle Ages as the Caritas Synthesis, which is an interesting term. Caritas is the Latin word for love. And so the Caritas Synthesis was what held together the society that governed the world, at least the Western world, for 1,500 years, and founded it, at least in theory, on the love principle. Now, obviously, we all know there were many shortcomings and people didn't always live up to what they professed, etc. We can make all the disclaimers. But that synthesis, the Caritas Synthesis, was really what gave rise to what we call Christendom. And we start to see the cracks in the facade through the 20s and 30s, accelerating through the 40s and into the 50s. And then in the 60s, we're ripe for the sexual revolution and the complete implosion of all of that. And look where we are now, 60 years downrange from that. It's been about 100 years since the roaring 20s, and we've had a century to deconstruct Christianity. I actually want to make the case for everybody who's listening to this I don't think we need to abandon Halloween, but we need to define our terms. We need to tell our children, this is not about ghosts and goblins, and we're not going to celebrate that. This is not even about harvest. In my mind, that doesn't go far enough. A lot of churches are holding, harvest festivals. Well, that's kind of secularized. And while thank God for the harvest, and we can give thanks for it, I think we want to go back and really reclaim our Christian roots and say, no. This is a holy day and it's a holy evening, and we're keeping watch night for some part of it, even if we're having a harvest festival and dunking for apples and giving out candy. We want people to think about these saints. And so one way to do that would be at our harvest celebrations that churches are doing. Why don't we look up in some of these things are available. There's books of the saints. Why don't we look up some of the lesser known saints? Here's one, Saint Hubertus. Does anyone know who Saint Hubertus is? He's the patron saint of the hunt. Well, there's a lot of hunters that are thinking about taking their venison in October and in early November. That depending on where you are in the country, deer season is opening. We could talk about Saint Hubertus. For those that are offended by Saint Hubertus, we could pick up somebody else. We could talk about, how about Saint Elizabeth? She's the mother of John the Baptist. Well, she bore a baby well, and like Mary, her baby was not one you would have expected, because it says she and her husband were past the age of childbearing. She'd hit menopause, but what do you know? Boom, the angel appears, Gabriel, and he says to Zechariah, you're going to be a father. He doesn't really believe it. He gets struck dumb, but who gets the burden of bearing that child in her aged body? Saint Elizabeth. So, her piety is shown, and she does well with it. And she obviously, together with Zechariah, raises John the Baptist to be a great prophet and the forerunner of Jesus himself. There are many of these kinds of people right in the Bible. You don't even need a register of the saints to look them up, but these people, we need to be commemorating them. We need to be thinking about them. We need to be giving honor to them, because they lived well in the Lord and they died well in the Lord. And with that, we can tell our children, it actually is possible for you to live in a way that honors Christ, no matter where you are, even if you're in a school where they don't believe in him and they take shots at him, pot shots, and the Aussie term is they slag off on him. It's still possible to stand up and be counted. Many Christians in the late Roman Empire did this. Sometimes it cost them their lives, I'm aware, but many times the fact that they were bold and confident in their proclamation and their witness for the Lord actually caused people to turn to faith in him. So I think that's really where we want to take Halloween in our time.
Yeah, man, I wish I would have known this. And we've had this conversation like months ago. We'd be doing this at the church. We'll do it next year. I love this idea of saying there's a way that you can live for the Lord even today, and celebrating. Even I'm thinking of one of my favorite people in the world that passed a couple of years ago, and he finished well and he did it well. And I would love to celebrate him too, and to say, look at all these people. I mean, you do enough funerals, you're in ministry long enough, you have to kind of like do some pretty awful funerals, and there's not a lot of great things to say, and you realize, boy, it's kind of rare for people to finish well. And I love this. I really love this. So I understand what you're saying about reclaiming it. I understand all of that sort of stuff. Can we talk, like, now I've been getting a lot of questions. I know you have. There's a heavy witchcraft, demonic, Church of Satan thing that is out there in the ethos, as though this is their night. They rule this night. If we participate in anything on this night, we're going to be demonized at best. Can we talk about that shift? I mean, I think you did a great job, sociology and psychologically, about the shifting from that. But where did we now get in the influence of the satanic realm and all of that? How does that play in?
Well, Jesus says in the book of John, the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. Part of what trick or treat started with was the idea that if you don't give me a treat, I'm going to play a trick. And commonly that would either be vandalism or theft. And by the way, thou shalt not steal is on the list of 10 commandments. So I don't know what more we need to say about that one. We don't really teach on the 10 Commandments anymore. They used to be posted in schools everywhere, but of course that's all been taken down. But the idea of trick or treat is the thief comes to steal, he comes to kill. That's also on the list of 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not murder. And then this destroy, well, that's in the realm of vandalism. So what are the themes that go around with Halloween these days? Stealing, vandalizing, destroying, and on some level killing. Now, of course, in popular culture, we're not glamorizing that. In the Church of Satan, they might be doing that. In fact, many times if you minister to people who are coming out of Satanism and the black arts, they will tell you that there are many ritual murders and sacrifices that occur on Halloween for that reason. But really, if we understand this idea that the thief, meaning that's a code word for Satan that Jesus uses there, the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy, then this tells you kind of the ultimate, what do we want to say, end game, the ultimate outcome of all demonic satanic activity. And really, I think this could be a really powerful time to unmask the works of darkness. You know, the scripture actually tells us in the book of Ephesians, I had it marked, hang on, I got to find it. Ephesians chapter 5, it says, do not participate in the things these people do. For once you were full of darkness, but now you have light from the Lord. So live as people of light. Now, you know, I don't think we need to abandon Halloween. Yeah, I know for some that's a shocking idea, but we do need to redefine what we mean by it. We are absolutely not going for axe in the head or knife in the head or goblins or skeletons and ghosts and witches. We're not doing any of that. But we can redefine Halloween. We can celebrate the fruit of the harvest. We can allow our kids to have fun and get apples and candy. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. We just need to recreate the context of it, because remember this, and I've taught on this many times for those that have, you know, heard me teach elsewhere. And I think we've even talked about this on some level on this podcast in the past. It's really the roots that we're concerned with. And then where do we go with those roots from here? So you could have good roots and current bad practice, or you could have bad roots, and rarely do things get righted. They just kind of stay in the rut. And so, you know, bad roots lead to even worse practices down the road. What I'm saying is, you know, this is very much in theme with our idea of the new Reformation. We need to reclaim Halloween for the benefit of our society and for the benefit of our children. And we need to just put our foot down and say, no, absolutely not. We are not going to celebrate Halloween in this way. We're going to celebrate Halloween for what it is, and we're going to have fun with it. And it's going to be good, clean fun, just like when the Jews would gather for their festivals throughout the year. Why can't we do something similar?
And I think it's important to point out here that you're not just an intellectual, you know, thinker and author. You're quite a hands-on practitioner and have significant contact, information, knowledge, and experience in directly dealing with the demonic. You know, this isn't something where you're just pontificating from some sort of standpoints. I mean, I've been around you enough to know it's rubbed off on me. I mean, we're, you know, we're actively kicking out some demons on a pretty regular basis, folks, yeah. And dealing with that stuff quite a bit. So, you know, I like your opinion. I also like your experience, and because we're not trying to negate the fact that there's demonic activity. Maybe there's a heightened demonic activity on that night, but that ain't usually something we run from. And
we're not going to be doing that in our celebrations. I mean, the dark side may be doing what they're doing, but we can do what we're doing. And I mean, I'm not going to run from darkness. I mean, sometimes I will step aside and avoid it. But we don't need to introduce all of that into our Christian conversation and our dialogue. Now this is obviously going to lead people to, well, what do I do with what they're doing at my kids' school, where they do have the ghosts and the, you know, goblins and the whatever. Now there, we might need to be a little bit more circumspect and say, I don't want you participating in that at school. We'll have our own celebration that's more consistent with the roots of this holiday. And I would actually tell my kids, even little ones can understand this. They stole our holiday, or we could say hijacked if they're a little older and they can understand what hijacking means. But they took our holiday. We're not giving it up, but we're also not going to celebrate it according to the dictates that they now have in place that make this all about blood and death and, scary stuff. There is no fear in love. And so back to the idea of the Caritas Synthesis, Halloween should not have all of that fearful stuff in it. And I might even add that for a lot of kids, they do get frightened by this stuff. People go to haunted houses and they get frightened, or they go to those, what do they call them? Fun houses, where the people are grabbing you and somebody jumps out and they're, covered in what appears to be blood. It might just be ketchup or red paint, but, they have a fake knife in their head. All of that is designed to incite fear and to create a momentary, breaking of your psychic defense perimeter, so that evil spirits can enter you. We don't need to walk in that fear. We're not called to walk in fear. We're called to walk in love and victory over this stuff. And I think if we teach our children correctly about this, they'll get it. And kids don't want to be scared. Maybe when they get to be teenagers, it's kind of cool to be scared. But honestly, I've ministered to enough people who have long-term, deep-rooted fear, not necessarily from Halloween, but sometimes, yes, from Halloween. But they've had long-term, deep-rooted fear, and they want out. They don't want to live that way. They don't want to be in that thing any longer. Why don't we give it to them? It's for freedom that Christ set us free. Why don't we set people free and give them back their holiday, give them back something they can celebrate at this time of year?
No, I think that's great. And I would say too, like my 6 and 11-year-old can understand that, hey, they don't really understand what they're playing with. Those are actually demons, and we're not going to celebrate that. We destroy the works of the devil with partnering with Jesus. We're on that same mission, so we're certainly not going to celebrate it. But if you want to be a blow up T-Rex and go around and get some Milky Ways, all right, you can do that. But I do think it's important to differentiate and to say that we don't do this.
That's right.
And there's a glorification of all of that now. We're a very spiritual country, and our psyches are very spiritual. I mean, look at Netflix's most watched list. That'll show you there's so many things about the supernatural, witchcraft on. There's a show about Satan that people watch. There's all of these things that are captivating the imaginations. I think because at the root of it, we have a longing for the supernatural. I think there's a longing that the Father put into us. We understand things are not the way that they were supposed to be, but I believe the enemy is obviously perverting that longing. And so, I think it's okay to have the conversation at a young age without making it weird, or without making it like a demon made me do something or whatever. You can say, listen, there are things in here. We're reading the Gospels. It's all through the gospel of Jesus, and people just don't quite understand what they're playing with.
Yeah, that's exactly it. We want to make everything we say to our children to be age appropriate.
Sure.
And if you're paying attention as a parent, you generally know about how far you can go with something with your kids. So my rule of thumb when explaining anything to our children was tell them less as opposed to more. Now, I'm not saying hide it. I'm just saying, kind of make it something that's age appropriate that they can understand. Don't give them all the detail I've just given on this podcast. But if they want to know more, well, then I will trickle in more, because one of the best ways to teach people anything is when they're asking you to tell them, then they're really receptive. And that's when you're going to get an audience from your kids saying, oh, wow, that's really interesting. I didn't know that. And the fact that this is one where we don't have to be Dr. No. We don't have to say, no, we're not going to do Halloween. We're absolutely going to do Halloween. We're just not doing it that way. So we're going to redefine how we express it. And, one of the things to think about is when it comes to costumes. One of my daughters was very, very into Belle. And then when Frozen came out, Elsa was a big hit. So one year we went trick-or-treating as Belle and as Elsa. There was no ghosts, there was no witches in any of that. That's perfectly wholesome stuff. I know some will take exception to some of the supernatural stuff Disney introduces, but those characters are fundamentally wholesome individuals. And so, and if you don't like that, they can dress up as, I don't know, the Scarecrow from Wizard of Oz, or, something else, whatever is appropriate. We just stay off of all that darkness. And that way our kids aren't being deprived. And that'll make it an easier sell for them. And it can become a conversation about Christian discipleship too, at an age appropriate level.
Right. And I think, man, there's a whole other podcast in here that I want to do that we're sort of like dancing around about raising your kids to follow Jesus and discipling your children. That's huge, and that's very much needed. And so I would love to revisit that, because we're touching on things that we could just rabbit trail on for hours. That's very important. So I'm trying not to go there, but I do think it's a great excuse and reason and opportunity to disciple your kids.
That's right.
And not to mention other kids, that might be joining. There is something about evangelism, and our neighborhood comes alive.
Yep.
And you want to get really scary. The really scary fact is, newsflash, most people are demonized that we run into. So yeah, November 1st is no different than Halloween. You're bumping up against some critters, but on Halloween, people are very open to, at least in my neighborhood here in Nashville, to just be extra relational. And I take that opportunity and really build relationships. And then my mindset is I'm going to pastor my neighborhood. And so I intentionally walk the neighborhood. I intentionally pray, not on Halloween. And when I see people, I make an effort to meet them. But Halloween is a great tool that I found to make that introduction, where people's guards are down and they're not just going into their garage and shutting it down. They're actually opening the doors to you. It's great.
Yep. By the way, on that point, so, one of the big challenges all of us face is, how do we do adult evangelism? I mean, I get it with the power evangelism when you are in the drive-through and you're, praying for the woman or the man who works at the drive-up window, or you're on the phone with T-Mobile or somebody like that, and you get a word on the phone. But, one of the things that if you, at least in my part of the world, I don't know about, everywhere else, but commonly on Halloween, you get these kind of trick-or-treating gangs. And so there might be, 10 or 20 kids, and their parents are walking with them, keeping an eye on things and just making sure it's all good. But it's a chance to be rubbing shoulders with other parents. And what an amazing opener. Does anyone here know, have you ever looked at what the origins of Halloween are? And they'll all go, no, I don't know. It's just, candy and ghouls and goblins. Yeah, okay. Well, actually, no. And I've just given you tons of information you could use right on this podcast. Halloween was a Christian holiday. And they'll be like, what? Yeah. And, you can just turn it into a conversation. You're not pitching Jesus to them. There I am using my quotation marks again for those who don't have the video feed. You're not just pitching Jesus to them. You can talk about the origins of it and how it changed over the centuries. And you can say, and now here's where we are today. Don't you think it'd be fundamentally more wholesome if we went back to the way it was? And I'm telling you what, even for people that are highly secularized and don't really have any interest in the church, they might even be hostile to the church, people still know something wholesome versus something unwholesome. And if you sort of call out, yeah, why do we have all this stuff about graves and people with a knife in their heart or in their head? Why do we have the Grim Reaper? Why do we have all of that stuff? Initially Halloween was a much more wholesome thing. Don't you think we want to be putting out wholesome ideas? Haven't we had enough of death and mayhem and, murder and school shootings and all of that? Wouldn't it be better? And, you can really get into a serious conversation just by using the fact that here we are walking around with our kids in the neighborhood collecting candy.
I love it. Well, we're coming up on our time. Before we do, I'm going to ask you a couple of rapid fire questions.
All right.
that I know people are going to have because I've gotten those questions. And
Well, then you should answer them.
well, no, I want you to answer them. So I know that the questions that I've gotten is, well, Ken, how is that any different than what you guys talk about with yoga or the martial arts or? So could you set the record straight?
Sure. Yoga is rooted in polytheism, also known as Hinduism. The yoga poses are prayer poses. They are literally worship postures. Just like when we put our hands together to pray or raise our hands when we're worshiping, those are our prayer postures. Yoga poses are prayer postures to pagan deities, and they are designed to energize you and to fill you with a spirit, but not the Holy Spirit. So the roots of yoga are themselves pagan. And similarly with most all of the martial arts, because all of this is coming out of Eastern thought, and there's a concept, particularly in Taoism, which is an Eastern religion, that deals with something known as the Qi, Q-I. Q-I, it's pronounced Qi. And so the Qi is the vital life force. It's very similar to those who know Star Wars, to the Force that they talk about all the time in Star Wars. And people who are practicing martial arts, an important part of what they do, particularly as they get into the higher levels, you really don't start learning this in a meaningful way until you hit your first level of black belt. So even up through brown belt, you're not really doing that. You're just learning basic moves. You're getting fluid. But above that is where you start to learn kind of the secrets. It's a little bit like the Freemasons. You really learn the really secret and powerful stuff above the 18th degree of Freemasonry. When you're first being initiated, you don't really know what you're signing on to. You don't really realize all that the words that you're saying, the oaths that you're taking, the vows that you're saying, what this is really leading you to. So when you're in the martial arts, you are, if you will, channeling the Qi. And in Taoism, they have two terms that they use. They're not interchangeably because they're not the same thing, but many people don't know this. There's something known as the Tao. And by the way, just to be clear, I'm saying it with a D sound because that's the proper pronunciation, but it's usually transliterated into English with a T, like tango. So it looks like Tao, T-A-O, but the right way to say it is Dao, D-A-O. So in Taoism, there is this thing called the Qi. Most of the Eastern thought systems deal with the Qi. And in Taoism, they have the energy of the Tao. And then there's another force that they call the De, also spelled T-E, but pronounced as though it were D-E. So the Tao and the De are both in play in the religion of Taoism. The Qi is kind of a common catch-all term that runs through most of the Eastern thought systems. And when you are doing martial arts, the objective is to be filled with that Qi, or that energy of the Tao and the De, specifically within the Taoist system, that it would fill you, empower you, give you the ability to, that your body would be like steel, that you could break boards, smash bricks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So both of these are rooted in a completely pagan thought system. When we talk about Halloween, as I've already said, Halloween is a Christian holiday. Now, somebody out there is probably going to say, well, what about Samhain, which was a Druid holiday that was celebrated around the same time? And Samhain actually originally started as a non-religious thing. I shouldn't say it that way. That's not a good way to say it. Harvest time was just a time to celebrate harvest. The Druids ultimately turned it into their own thing, Samhain, and the Catholic Church attempted to reclaim it with All Saints' Day and go back to the roots in harvest. So we've always had Samhain and Halloween running on parallel tracks. Ultimately, Catholicism in the Western Empire and in the fragments of the Roman Empire became ascendant. And so it didn't really much matter if you were in England or France or, Spain or Germany or Switzerland or Italy or, wherever. And then we start moving into the Eastern Empire as well. And, it could be Poland or now the Czech Republic and so forth, Slovakia. I don't mean to omit anybody. So please don't anyone get upset that I'm not naming every country. I'm just trying to give an example here. But the bottom line is, throughout all of those areas, the Catholic Church was trying to reclaim the holiday. They weren't simply Christianizing Samhain.
So in other words, they had it first.
Right.
Roots.
Precisely. Right. We're back to roots.
Back to roots. And so I think that's an interesting thing. And again, another podcast that we can talk about when it comes to the difference between Christianizing something that is not fundamentally Christian.
Right.
And, bringing restoration to something
that is
that was fundamentally Christian. I think those are very different concepts, and that nuance is probably very important to talk through. So again, we've got several more episodes that have just come out of this episode that I'm really looking forward to, and we've got a lot of interviews and a lot of fun things coming down the pipe. But we're going to, I think, land it here at this point. So Ken, thank you so much. This is literally a very timely word because just in a couple of days we're gonna have Hallow Even. Is that what you said? We're gonna have the Hallow Even.
All Hallows Even would be the proper way to say the whole thing.
Well, in Tennessee we say of an even and of an morning, and so I'm gonna go off here because it is of an even, and I got to get to dinner.
All right.
Thank you so much, Ken, for joining us, and thank you all for tuning in. And we look forward to next week. We'll be right back here. So God bless.
We've recently updated the Orbis Ministries app with Ken's free teaching archive. You can click on the link in the description of this podcast to download today.